So as David before me, I will just speak briefly to their bios to introduce you to them, but I suspect that you are quite well aware of who they are and their very important work. We have got Jeff Sparrow, who is a writer and educator and broadcaster. And he works at the University of Melbourne in Naarm, and his books include No Way But This, In Search of Paul Robeson, wonderful figure who visited Australia. Crimes Against Nature, Capitalism and Global Heating, Trigger Warnings, Political Correctness in the Left, and other works. So quite a broad, range of interests there. We're fortunate to have Ghassan Hage, and I will just bring up, he probably needs no introduction either. And I found out through Facebook the interesting factoid that you were known as Jason early on, which was quite interesting, but, you reverted back to your Arabic name. Ghassan is a professor of anthropology who works on the anthropology of racism, colonialism and ethno-nationalism, and he has done a lot of work across several countries and continents, particularly as it pertains to Australia, Lebanon, Europe and Israel, Palestine, and he'll be talking to his experience regarding the Max Planck Institute. We have Lana Tatour, who works at the University of New South Wales. And just bear with me while I bring up her impressive biographical statement. She's a senior lecturer in global development there. She's a scholar of settler colonialism, indigeneity, race and citizenship with a focus on Palestine. Just last year, she came out with a co-edited book, Race and the Question of Palestine. And she's also a public commentator. She's appeared on several outlets, and we're very pleased to have Lana here. And then my University of Sydney colleague, Nick Riemer, who, as many of you know, is a linguistics academic here at the institution. He's a long-term participant in the Palestine Solidarity Movement and the author of Boycott Theory and the Struggle for Palestine a couple of years ago, and numerous articles, the latest of which appeared in Overland just a few days ago, and it's a terrific and important read. And as also many in this room know, along with John Keane, he's currently the object of a Zionist lawfare case. So the bios are there, and I didn't mean to read all of them, but they do bear reminding ourselves of their backgrounds. So I might start with Jeff. Over to you.
Thanks, everyone. And I just want to start by acknowledging the hard work of the organisers putting on such a terrific event, a really heroic effort in difficult circumstances. So congratulations to everyone involved. What I thought I would do in the brief time allocated to me is try to find a way to orient us in the hallucinogenic landscape of the campus today, where on the one hand we are facing almost unprecedented repression. On the other hand, we, at least some of us, are working in institutions that I think could be fairly described as still in some ways culturally liberal. I don't just mean that many of us work with colleagues who are deconstructing this or overturning this or revolutionising the other. I mean more than that. Most of the higher education institutions have mission statements where they proclaim that they are opposed to sexism, where they proclaim that they are for diversity, they are against homophobia, and where they proclaim that they are opposed to racism. At the same time, these anti-racist institutions are doing everything they can to suppress a movement which is trying to fight against a genocide being conducted by an apartheid state. So how do we make sense of this contradictory situation? I think it's useful to look at different ways that we might understand oppression and the struggle against it. It's useful, I think, to look back to the great social struggles of the 60s and the 70s because they still inform how questions of oppression are discussed. So if you think about the struggle against the Vietnam War, if you think about the campaigns for national liberation, for Black liberation, for women's liberation, for gay liberation, you can identify one strand and a dominant strand in the 60s and the 70s, which oriented to the broadest possible number of people through participatory events, through protests, through strikes, through public meetings, and sought to change the structures of society to deliver a material change for the benefit of the oppressed and the disempowered. And one way to think about this is in terms, I use the term direct politics. And I think it's a kind of politics that many of us here would engage with, a kind of grassroots politics seeking to change institutions and deliver material outcomes. But that's not the only tendency that emerged from that time, particularly if you think about higher education. And if we move the clock forward to a little bit later on, say the mid-1970s, you can identify historically a trend where ex-student activists begin to enter the academy and increasingly look, instead of looking to the mass movements, see institutions or the state as the power that can deliver alternatives to oppression. So if we think about direct politics as some kind of orientation to the people as a form of agency, we can think about what I call delegated politics as an orientation that sees the people as a passive recipient of change delivered by others. And this tends to be, in these formulations, a change which isn't so much structural or material, but is much more focused on the cultural or symbolic. This is the moment of the identity politics that is still with us today. And I think we could have a useful conversation about the role that that plays in this movement. But what I wanted to really focus on is a third moment. So if we think about direct politics as a movement that sees the people as an agency for change, and if we think about delegated politics as a strategy that sees the people as the passive recipient of change, we can also talk about something that I call smug politics, which sees the people as an obstacle that needs to be overcome, that identifies the people as a source of backwardness and stupidity and racism and sexism, and therefore argues to an orientation to the powerful to constrain the backwardness of ordinary people. And this, I would argue, is the predominant political orientation of the higher echelons of the university sector, of the vice-chancellors and the people around it. And you can see it in action if you think about, say, how we might respond to the epidemic of sexual harassment and sexual violence in higher education. If we took a direct politics approach, we might argue, say, for a union campaign, fighting against sexism in every workplace, but also pushing back against the structures that make university such a playground for predators. The precarity, the disparity between those in higher positions and those in low positions, the insecurity, and so on and so forth. That would be a direct political response. A smug politics approach, which is the one generally taken by the universities, pushes in completely the other direction. It would implement something like a mandatory training system for all staff, coupled with a new system, new regime, punishment and surveillance, probably massive expenditure on consultants, and then a press release highlighting the achievement of the vice-chancellor by getting a pay rise and thus smashing the glass ceiling. And I think that the difference between these two orientations is really important in trying to make sense of the position that we see ourselves, because there are other industries where the employers are less ideological and are more just focused on making money. Higher education is not like that. Higher education is very ideological, and the people in charge see themselves as intervening in the public sphere and pushing a particular agenda. And that agenda is dominated by this kind of smug politics. And that has a series of implications. If we think about the campuses today and we think about the kind of repression that we're facing, it's not simply that the higher echelons of the university are ideological Zionists, though some of them are. It's not simply that the vice-chancellors see the political utility of supporting the government on Israel, though many of them do. It's also that they are committed to a particular orientation that can identify as anti-racist a ban on protests. Because if you identify the people as a whole as a source of racism and backwardness, then suppressing them is necessarily part of your program to fight racism. And so I think identifying these trends is really important, well, in two ways. Partly because it helps us to orient ourselves in a climate where all around us we hear, our bosses and the heads of the universities talk about how they're campaigning against racism. It's really important to understand the way we talk about racism and the way they talk about racism are not two strategies to achieve the same ends. They are two methods that are moving in completely diametrically opposed distinctions. I think that's really important to orient ourselves in the modern campus. But I also think that thinking in this way can allow us a certain degree of optimism. One of the things that gives me some hope is the people who run our universities are almost universally hated within higher. The statistics. Where I work in Melbourne University, we do these surveys of staff attitudes. And my God, the attitudes to the management are extraordinary. Now, there's lots of reasons for this, right? It's partly that everyone knows how extraordinarily well that they're paid. It's partly that in all sorts of ways they're completely incompetent, but it's also that the particular kind of politics that they have combines a kind of self-righteousness with a condescension that rubs most people up the wrong way. I hope people saw the extraordinary episode in the Sydney Morning Herald a couple of days ago where a pro-vice-chancellor from one of the New South Wales universities responded to an article about AI use in the universities and published an article chiding students for using AI and explaining that it was important that you grasp the difficulty of writing articles yourself, yada, yada, yada. Turns out the article was written by AI. And this, to me, exemplifies the mindset of the people who are running higher education, absolute disdain they have for people in institutions that they are managing. What I think that means is that even though the repression that we are facing is very intense, it does seem to me that the vice-chancellors, the university management cannot necessarily take for granted that there is a body of support for their actions. I suspect that the consensus for the things that they're doing is incredibly brittle, precisely because so many people recognise the gulf between the people at the top of these institutions and the rest of us down below. And I think that is provides an opportunity and something that we can leverage.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Really good to get that top level overview of things and invoking some of the more recent AI funnies that have happened. Let's call them. Shall we move on to Lana?
I think can you hear me?
You'll need to go up if you could.
I need to go, so I can't use that privilege. Okay, that's fine.
That's full.
Thank you. Is there? I need also. Does this work? Yeah. So I'll try to use this one. Those at the back, if you can't hear me, I'm the annoying person who kept telling people to speak up. So do the same if you can't hear me. I want to start by expressing my absolute deep gratitude to the organizers of the conference. They are doing this at a critical political moment for freedom of speech, academic freedom, the fight against racism, the fight against the neoliberal university. Everything is intersecting. And the assault is coming from so many different directions. And I just want to express my deep gratitude, because we know organizing these things are not easy, necessary, especially not in this climate. So really, thank you for your efforts. I didn't write an intervention for today. I wanted to hear the conversation that was evolving today. And I'm lucky I didn't, because I would have been disappointed to have repeated a lot of what have been said. Maybe I'll start with a quote by Mahmoud Darwish. So, writing in the 1970s, and this is in JPS, the Journal of Palestine Studies, reports that Mahmoud Darwish, and I'm quoting, described the atmosphere of anti-Palestinian prejudice in Europe. He was at the time in France. Then they quote Darwish saying, and I'm quoting him now, in Europe, the atmosphere, already ready to explode against the Arabs, was full of Zionist agitation against Palestinians in particular. End of quote. After the Bondi massacre, I was lucky to travel to Palestine and leave the country for a while. I was visiting family. I'm born and raised in Palestine. I'm 48er. For those who don't know what 48er means, I'm a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship. I was visiting my family and was happy to be away from here, seeing the explosion of anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim racism that was exploding. And I remember telling to my sisters, I have never felt such an assault on my identity as a Palestinian, on my very being as Palestinian, as I am feeling now. And it sounds odd coming from a place of being a Palestinian in the Israeli state, subject to its vast racial discrimination, racial domination, settler colonialism, apartheid. But it is here that I felt my being as Palestinian being the most compromised. Now, there are different reasons for that. Part of it, when I'm in my homeland, this is my homeland, right? This is my community. This is my strength. But there are other reasons. And the other reasons is the one that go back to Mahmoud Darwish's quote, that deep, deep anti-Palestinian racism that animates Western attitudes towards us, that allows this genocide to take place. So I think it's important to understand what we are facing these days. And unfortunately, I think we haven't seen the worst yet. What we are facing is not only a strong Zionist lobby that on the one hand feels under siege because it knows that the consent on which it has operated in the liberal West in the past no longer exists in terms of the public opinion, and it resorts to force, only to force and coercion. We're not only facing this brutal Zionist lobby, we're actually in this country facing a Zionist lobby that is being resourced by the state itself. Hundreds of millions of dollars reaching to sponsor political repression, shrinking freedoms on all fronts, making each one of us a target because they can, because they have the resources, the surveillance that we are facing, the Murdoch press that is fueling this McCarthyism. And it is state-sponsored repression. And I think it's really important to understand what the Australian state is actually doing here. And of course, that could be explained by it being a settler colonial state, a racist state, and so on and so forth. But there is still something quite striking in seeing a supposedly Labor government actually feeding into a far-right agenda. I'm not a Labor supporter, that's for sure, but it seems to be shooting themselves in the foot. But even McCarthyism doesn't begin to kind of capture this moment, because as historian Ellen Schrecker, who's a historian of McCarthyism, said, this moment is worse than the actual McCarthyist era in many ways. I want to now do an abrupt shift to a different topic. And it is, Palestine is the cause of our moment, of our lifetime. And, all roads still lead to Palestine, to Gaza, as was said earlier. And we have a lot of activism on campus and beyond on Palestine. But as a scholar of Palestine studies, I must insist on Palestine as a scholarly field. What is happening with the lobby, but unfortunately also in the way sometimes we fight the repression in universities, is the reduction of the study, the inquiry, the teaching on Palestine as a matter of activism, as a matter of identity, and as a narrative. It is a scholarly field that has to teach us so much about race, settler colonialism, and international law, liberalism, and so on and so forth. And here I want to quote Shireen Sekole. Palestine is not a laboratory. It is not a problem to be solved. It is not an object of salvation. Palestine is a paradigm. Palestine is a paradigm that can teach us about our present condition of the permanent temporary. And now I want to shift abruptly to a third kind of theme. And that is the focus on anti-Semitism as the cause of anti-racism in the kind of liberal colonial mindset in the West. And the risk that we are constantly seeing, and here I'm also kind of building on something that Professor Nadia Al-Haj has said in the past, is that we see our institutions bring in Islamophobia in order to justify a focus on anti-Semitism and in order not to acknowledge anti-Palestinian racism. The establishment of the position of the special envoy on Islamophobia wasn't really because of care of Islamophobia. It was a way to justify Gillian Segal in her role. Similarly, now that the universities want to adopt a definition of anti-Semitism, they're saying, and we'll adopt a definition of Islamophobia and other forms of racism. That's not out of care And secondly, as Jordi said, I don't want an Islamophobia definition. I want an intersectional understanding of anti-racism. But it's really important to see how these moves, how these liberal moves are taking place, and to be careful not to reproduce them in the way that we struggle within the university and against the university. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lana. That was great. Some great reflections there on Palestine as a prism, what it has to teach us in this moment, and also on peak McCarthyism, recalling earlier reflections on preemptive McCarthyism. Ghassan Hage, please take your stand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move you a bit to Germany and talk about some of the issues that emerged as I was having an interesting misadventure with Max Planck Society, and reflect a little bit about what these issues tell us about free speech and free Palestine. So very quickly, let me go very quickly first, and just in case people don't know, but I was sacked from my position as a visiting professor at Max Planck in Germany. And it started with a Springler right-wing newspaper of the type we know very well here, attacking me in a full-page article on the basis of my Facebook declarations about what was happening in Gaza. And I got the legendary phone call, which I know now so many of my colleagues who have been subjected to this have received, from the journalists telling me that they've done their research, which meant that they looked over my Facebook, by the way. That's very sad. We've done the research, and this is what we found, blah, blah, blah. And then they said, do you understand that people will think of you as an anti-Semite? And, I mean, you can think of me whatever you like, but I've been through many people attacking me as anti-Semite well before Gaza. Some of you might remember that I organized with John Docker the first academic boycott. That was like 20 years ago plus, and I had to deal with a lot of people accusing me of anti-Semitism. So I also used the right-wing newspapers asking questions like this, and I always knew that it's a prelude to an attack, whether you answer or not. And so I didn't reply to them. And sure enough, there was the page describing me as anti-Semite, vile. I mean, pretty ridiculous stuff. Something like, with no exaggeration, believe me, I was described as having finished the job of spreading anti-Semitism in Australia. I've moved to Germany in order to sort of like do the job there. Literally, I kid you not. And so I warned my colleagues at Max Planck that something will be happening. And they said, sure, full solidarity, etc. But then it became very clear that I was caught up in a very German situation where the newspaper was using me to attack Max Planck as a whole and subject it to some kind of like state reasons, as you might know what that is, and to kind of like domesticate it into accepting whatever it wants. And so I expected that my superiors will support me, as in my superiors. What I mean by that, my institutional superiors, the managerial superiors, the ones we've learned to hate so much. I expected, well, they will support me, but they totally panicked and immediately asked me to secretly sever, which I frankly didn't care that. I mean, I'm a visiting professor, so it's not that my livelihood was kind of like in danger or anything like this, or my reputation really. But what was interesting was that they thought that I had something to benefit by letting things happen quietly. And he said, look, we won't say anything. And I'm going to say, you won't say anything about fucking what? What is it you won't say anything about that I care about? And so, but now as I kept repeating, we won't say anything if you don't say anything. And I said, well, no, I mean, I don't understand why I should sign anything like this secrecy agreement. We'll give you all your wages. I said, I'm actually quite fine. Australia pays me really well. I don't care about your money. It's but what happened is they said, look, we obviously disagree. I said, yeah, I have no problem. If you want to say we disagree, that's fine. I'll go. I mean, I'm a visitor in Germany. I've tried to reform Australia and haven't succeeded. I'm not going to reform Germany in 2 years in Germany, I'll go. But what the fatal thing was that they didn't just simply say, okay, we disagree, we're going to part our way. They said that, and they said, there is no acceptance of anti-Semitism in Max Planck. That was the last. And I said, well, I'm not parting company with you. I want you to sack me publicly because I want people to see this sentence so that they can understand why I'm going to challenge. So I chose to be sacked rather than dismissed calmly or whatever the option was. And interestingly, when I appealed, suddenly the anti-Semitism charge disappeared. And they said, well, actually, we have no problem about anti-Semitism with you. Our problem with you is that you are anti-Israel. Literally, like this. So there was no argument about equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism or any of these interesting variations. It was a direct thing. We like Israel. You don't like Israel. We want to say, okay. And I said, well, actually, I don't mind. You don't like Israel. You like Israel, and I don't like Israel. Let's make it. So why don't you remove the bit where you say there's no anti-Semitism? You say, oh, no, we won't remove that. And so it was kind of like anti-Semitism by innuendo because they knew they couldn't argue it in court. But in court, actually, I was attacked for being anti-Israel. And Max Planck's interest is blah, blah, blah. And I mean, to make it even more ridiculous, the lawyer of Max Planck kept, during the court case, calling the director of Max Planck, who was in Jerusalem. And he was making these phone calls to Jerusalem during the court case to see what he thinks and what he not think. Anyway, it ended up with a farcical moment where the judge agreed with Max Planck that I have shown whatever antipathy to Israel. And then here the judge, as a final statement, made this thing, looked at me, showed me a print of my Facebook, and he said, I mean, it's really quite amazing when I think about it. Even now, I think how farcical, tragicomic it is. He said, you have called Israel a Zionist project. That's it. And I'm saying that. He said, he said, project, it means you don't believe that Israel exists. Right? And I'm kind of like, oh. And this was the final judgment, right? I mean, it's not that I could say, excuse me, I'm a social theorist. Let me tell you about the history of the usage of the term project. It's not only about Israel, about any nation, etc. But it's not there for intellectual argument. It's the judge deciding on the basis of project. And that is something which I want to share with you, the story, because this is where it brings something about speech, if you like. For some weird reason, I remembered something that happened to me when I was doing my PhD. And I was doing my PhD on the Lebanese forces, the Christian Lebanese forces. I'm from a Christian Lebanese origin. All my friends in Lebanon were Christian Lebanese when I left. So when I go back to Lebanon, I go and spend time with my Christian Lebanese friends who are mostly right-wingers, kind of like. And so we were sitting at, I'll tell you, I won't go on because I don't have that much time, but to make a long story short, we're sitting, having fun, listening to music, enjoy something. And this guy started talking about how, which was very common view among the Maronites in Lebanon, that the Palestinians have given up on Palestine. And they really want to take over Lebanon. And they'd be happy to just stay in Lebanon and take over Lebanon instead of going back to Palestine. And I kind of like thought, said to him, actually, I mean, this is a bit ridiculous. If you look at all the educational material that the Palestinians are distributing in the camps, all of them say, let's go back to Palestine. So if they really want to take over Lebanon, why would they educate people about going back to Palestine? What proof have you got? I said. It was the middle of the civil war in Lebanon, right? And here was among my Christian friends, but I didn't know that guy, defending the Palestinians. And this guy looked at me and he said, you want proof? Wait a second, I'll go to my car, get my gun, and show you proof. And I kind of like, suddenly, something quite weird happened to me because I've been lulled into thinking while in Australia that the world was one big tutorial. Let's have a lovely conversation. And everything is available for interesting intellectual conversation. And suddenly this guy comes and says, I don't want to be in a tutorial. I'm in the middle of a bloody war. And this is my view. And go to hell. I will shoot you if you don't like it. This is to show you something. We, at the moment, we are no longer in a tutorial. This is the tragedy of our university. Somebody has managed to kidnap our tutorial. And we are in the midst of wars. And anybody who treats Zionist speech as if it is a tutorial discussion is making a category mistake, because Zionist speech is not a truth claim. It is a claim aiming to shoot you. It's metaphorically, maybe, but it is a speech aiming to hurt you and subdue you. It is not an argument about. There is no point us sitting, taking Zionist speech. Oh no, you're wrong about this. Oh no, you're wrong about that. As if Zionists are interested in having some kind of tutorial conversation which lead us to some truth. But that is where it seems to me the problem lies, because this kind of speech is frankly mediocre speech from an intellectual perspective. I mean, the mediocrity of what I have had to cope with in court and during my saga is truly intellectual mediocrity. You call me elitist, I don't mind. I am elitist. I've worked bloody hard on making my thought really complex. I've worked for years on making myself. It's not something I inherited. I'm not born a prince. I worked hard. It's very Marxist labor value. You know, I've labored on making myself a complex intellectual. So if I see mediocre thought, I would say, this is mediocre thought. There's zero bloody labor in it. And so speech, you see, I mean, political expression in the contemporary university, we want to ask ourselves, is political expression that comes out of the university the same as political expression outside the university? Is there something specific about political expression when it comes out of the university that carries the fact that it is coming out from a university? Do we want to protect something specific about the political speech that comes out from the university? Not just, we have to protect all political speech and the freedom of political speech. I'm not making one against the other, but I want to say there's something also, because as we are faced with the mediocrity of Zionist argumentation, we could easily slip in counter-mediocre arguments, but effective ones. You know. But we have training, we train ourselves. If someone is homophobic, we know how to restrain ourselves. Maybe we could hurt them by calling them a pufta, but we don't say that because we know we don't want to fall into the same trap. We want to maintain some relation to something which is outside battle, something that is specific to the university, i.e., something that does quality of knowledge that only you can get at the university, and we have the duty of protecting that quality of knowledge coming out of the university on top of trying to fight. But then we have to cope with the fact that our managers no longer want to create the conditions for the kind of speech that we ought to be protecting. So we all have to fight the Zionists and fight the Maoists. So I feel I don't have any answers. I feel, in fact, that all day I've heard answers. All day I've heard things that made me feel, yes, there's things I can grab to make the struggle possible. But I think maybe I want to add a depressive thing so that we don't enjoy ourselves too much. I don't think there is enough recognition of how defeated we are. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, and I'm into, let's do it, comrades, as much as anyone else. But we want to do it recognizing the scale of the defeat. We don't want to walk over the scale of the defeat. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ghassan. And I just want to say that you've been a leading light for all of us who have followed you. And I think your words are taken well on board, that this is a defeat that we have to kind of absorb and metabolize. And our colleagues are experiencing that as we speak in this process. But thank you for highlighting the tragicomedy of the Lebanese forces in particular, coming from a similar background. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everyone. I'm not going to worry about repeating points that have been made already in the day, because speaking for myself, I've appreciated the interventions of other speakers enormously and have learned a lot from them. I'd like to thank each and every one of them for coming and giving us the benefit of their analysis and insight. And I'd like to make a short number of points in response to that very rich and insightful analysis that we've heard so far today. And the first point is about the issue which is really, I think, at the centre of the repression of political expression on campuses and in society today, namely Zionists' demands for safety and how we should understand them. Despite loud claims of an anti-Semitism crisis on campus, obviously no evidence of anything remotely approaching one has ever been produced. Instead, Israel's defenders are presenting support for Palestine as a threat to their safety and demanding that it must be totally expunged from the campus. And many Royal Commission witnesses have made exactly the same demand for society in general. Now, no doubt some Zionists have been made to feel uncomfortable by the proposition that Palestinians deserve not to be genocided. But Israel supporters aren't interested in interrogating their feelings or engaging in any questioning of why they might be experiencing them. They're not after a conversation aimed at greater mutual understanding. They're after our scalps. They've chosen the lawfare road to social cohesion. So they elevate their feelings into a universal arbiter of political conduct. In their world, anti-Semitism can never, in fact, be eliminated. They need to keep it existing so they can go on demonising us with it, as a number of speakers today have already said. Zionist organisations are calling for the erasure of Palestinians and their allies from the public sphere. The more magnanimous among them concede that, sure, we can criticise Israel, just not anywhere that a Jewish person might hear us. And obviously, what that means is that there's nowhere for them that criticism of Israel is acceptable. The very demand for Palestinians to take their politics elsewhere should, I think, be understood for what it is: a call for a world in which Palestinians, as political actors, are systematically placed out of sight. And that is a demand for political segregation. Another way of putting it is that Zionists want a form of apartheid in the global north, and I think we should be very clear about that. My second point is that university administrations are exemplary of the general capitulation of the professional managerial class in the global north to genocide. And again, this is a point that has been raised on multiple occasions by the people speaking today. Across the West, university managements have criminalised Palestinian identity and thrown their institutional weight behind Israel. Occasionally, they've tried to maintain some plausible deniability by clucking and tut-tutting about the so-called situation in the Middle East. Obviously, no one's fooled. University leaders' support for an apartheid and genocidal state is a sharp reprimand, I think, to anyone who was ever naive enough to imagine that liberal institutions will oppose racism when doing so actually matters. University leaders' justification for their loyalty to genocide and their determination to crush the Palestine solidarity movement, these are degrading insults to the intelligence as well as to decency. University leaders' rationalizations have glorified prejudice and ignorance. They're a travesty of the intellectual and political seriousness that an institution of higher learning should aspire to. Of course, we already knew that vice-chancellors, provosts, deans and other senior university leaders are deeply, deeply compromised, and that their talk of anti-racism, progress and free speech is largely or wholly hollow. But I think I'm right in saying that many of us didn't expect them to be quite as bankrupt, racist and cynical as they have proven to be. They have given no indication whatsoever of any scruples or reservations at all about enforcing compliance with genocide. So, and this is my conclusion of this point, let's not make the same mistake again. Let's remember forevermore that we're employed by people who, when they were given the choice, chose to enable genocide and then dared to lecture us about safety. That's the basis on which we should approach them in the future. They've shown us what side they're really on. Let's just believe them and treat them accordingly. The third point is that through their repression of pro-Palestinian voices, university managements have made acquiescence to genocide a basic condition of students' access to education and of academics' ability to undertake teaching and research. Personally, I find this deeply shocking. They tell us that you can oppose genocide or you can come to campus. The various kinds of educational and intellectual value produced in universities are now explicitly understood as entailing silence over Palestine, and I can assure you that students understand this very well. Accepting genocide has become the price of learning. I think it's hard to conceive of a more corrupting development. For many Palestine supporters, working at a university feels like being in occupied territory behind enemy lines. That's why events like this are so important, I think. At a time when many people feel that it's never been so urgent to express themselves politically, university administrations are preventing staff and students from doing so. It's a coercive depoliticization that's being inflicted on us, and it's extremely violent. It establishes acquiescence to the annihilation of Palestinian life as a norm, and for the ruling class, of which obviously university managements are a part, it has the added and not inconsequential spin-off of discouraging political expression in general in a whole generation of students. Fourthly, I want to make the point that repression of Palestine advocates on campus is facilitated by the overbearing structures of compliance and administrative control that characterise universities, and also by the general climate of authoritarianism and precarity prevailing under contemporary capitalism. Without the extremely complex bureaucratic apparatus that exists in universities, and without the insecurity of university staff in a scarcity economy, there would just be fewer opportunities for administrators to censor speech and political activity. The balance of forces in the contemporary university has decisively shifted in favour of administrators. In fact, I think we can say that academic freedom in the neoliberal university has been replaced by administrative freedom as the institutional ideal in higher education. 2 more points, they're both quick ones. The second last one is that when we look at the wave of unprecedented political repression in society, what we find is that universities are leading the way. University managements talk progressive, but we should actually understand them, I think, as far-right political actors. The protest restrictions introduced by the New South Wales government after Bondi and the slogan bans imposed by Queensland, these were anti-democratic measures that were trialled on university campuses before they were rolled out in society more widely. Rather than serving as beacons of democratic values, the university has been in the vanguard of the frightening erosion of fundamental liberties post-October 7. My last point, perhaps predictably, is that resistance to this isn't just necessary, it's also possible. And we've heard many examples of the possibilities of resistance from speakers throughout the day. And I'd just like to pay tribute to everyone like Jemana, like Grace, like all of the people standing up against the ferocious opposition that they're experiencing from every quarter of their workplace and indeed society as they try to say that genocide is wrong. This symposium itself is a small example of the possibility of resistance. We had to fight for the right to hold this event on campus, and we won. We'd like, in fact, to thank the Sydney branch of the Maritime Union of Australia. They made their auditorium available to us as a backup venue, and at one point, as various speakers have suggested, it looked as though we might need it. Symposia and conferences are all well and good, but we need more than just fine words from platforms. One of the reasons that management here allowed this symposium to happen, I think, is that they know that it doesn't seriously compromise their political control of the campus. I think what's going through their mind is the thought, let the academics chatter, it doesn't actually affect us much. We need more militancy in the university sector of the kind that we associate with the Maritime Union and other so-called blue-collar unions. We need to defy more courageously the restrictions on political expression that have been imposed on us, and we need to make Palestine, racism, and political expression industrial issues over which we strike so that we hold the people and institutions who have lined up unhesitatingly behind Israel's relentless genocide in Gaza to account, and so that next time, God forbid, we can spend longer talking about genocide or whatever the next atrocity is and less time talking about freedom of speech. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nick. I think you've really outlined and highlighted for us how we need to meet violent acquiescence with militancy. And I think most of us in this room would agree. That leaves us with, we're making really good time. Very sobering addresses by all 4 speakers. We do have half an hour for Q&A. And I suspect that we will have some questions in the room. We can have our trusty Mike Prentice. Putting you coming back.
Yep.
Back to questions. Should I just? Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Thank you. They were great. I've caught the tail end of this, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating something that came up before, but I wanted to kind of pick up on 2 things that like Nick and Ghassan said. Nick, you were talking about how the university is currently using these administrative structures and precarity and stuff like that that are built up because of the neoliberalization of the university. And Ghassan, you were talking about your encounter with your Lebanese Christian friends where they said, I'll give you evidence, and it's in my car, it's a gun, basically. And I'm wondering, my question is basically, I've only been involved in pro-Palestine stuff for a couple of years, but so since Al-Aqsa flood, but my question is, like, has it changed? Are we facing something qualitatively different in terms of free speech and repression of speech, or has it always been like this? I don't know.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Joel?
Thank you again. You know, I'm really, maybe this is a bit preemptive, but I'm really struck by the relevance of Karl Popper's tolerance of intolerance, and you know, some of the earlier speakers that we had today, or the fact that we cannot have tolerance for intolerance, you know, because that intolerance leads to you know, issues around our freedom of speech. And I was struck by many of the speakers today saying how their colleagues didn't support them, how everybody was silent. I've seen Zionists in the union. My question is about what happens after we win, if we win. How do we coexist with people who want to do genocide, who want to silence us? How do we coexist with fascists? We cannot coexist with these people.
Thanks, Joel.
Question, a reflection that I've come to in the course of listening to these presentations, just the question of how close we are to the Germany model here in Australia. I mean, in my time agitating around BDS, universities have generally said they've had one of three responses. One response has been the institutional neutrality. The other response has been to say, well, Australia officially engages with Israel, so therefore we will officially engage with Israel, just kind of pegging it to Australian foreign policy. Because of everything that Jeff said about the progressive commitments of universities these days, universities advertising themselves as having these distinctive mission and so on, I don't think you hear those two responses as much. So then all they've really got left is this idea that ongoing engagement with Israel reflects our positive commitments to human rights, etc. Right? And we do actually hear that from time to time. I think one of the worst things a university has said in the whole last 3 years was one point, I think a couple of years ago here at Sydney University, where they actually put out a statement saying that our ongoing engagement with Israeli universities reflects our commitment to human rights. And, you know, it's the corollary to that then would be to say something like, well, you know, anyone opposing Israel is opposing human rights, you know, inconsistent with our commitment to human rights to oppose Israel. But I feel that the universities have not quite been willing to make that leap and just go after people in the same way that they have, for example, in Germany. But I feel like we might be sort of at a threshold where that's the obvious path for them to go down if they choose to. But I'm curious to hear people's thoughts on that.
I take those three reflections and then we'll come back and do a second round. So I think that what you've all spoken to speaks to the Holocaust guilt, diversity washing that Jeff spoke to at the beginning, and also touches upon the experience of the Max Planck Institute that Ghassan spoke about, and the university's vanguard of erosion of civil liberties that Nick spoke about, and also Lana's experience. So, yeah, if you wanted to collect your thoughts and comment upon those three items.
Somebody was asking, I thought it should be. Somebody was asking me about how far back this goes. I mean, I think it is worth remembering that the crackdown on protests began with a crackdown on environmental protesters. Then the crackdown on climate protests, and the lessons they learned from that were then extended to Gaza. So I think what we're seeing is the intensification of trends that have been existing for a long time. I mean, Gaza is a multiplier of all of these things that are happening. Where exactly that will end? And I guess in some respects, it's up to us. Just on Dave's thing about whether we're heading towards the Germany situation? I reckon it's a really open question, isn't it? I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is what's been happening in the cultural sector, where they have been willing to destroy Khoury festivals rather than to allow, a pro-Palestine speaker, we're willing to destroy the agent, an institutional in Australia rather than publish a pretty vile kind of article. And I think it's what we're going to see now. Are they actually prepared to destroy the universities? Are they actually prepared to say somewhere like, Sydney University, well, okay, everyone has to sign some statement of loyalty to Israel, and if that drives out top academics, well, it's a good thing. I don't know the answer to that, but I feel like that's, going to be on the agenda.
No, it's not working.
It's working for the students.
It's working for the Zoom.
I think this one's better.
Yes.
To be honest, I don't think we're very far off from the Germany model in Australia. And I think it's not necessarily about what universities are declaring or what are the laws, but it is about what is being allowed and not allowed in universities. The number of complaints against staff, the number of staff who are no longer willing to teach on Palestine because even a 15 minutes a covering of Palestine in the mildest sense can result in an investigation, because the Murdoch press is literally taking snippets of our lectures and Sky News and going after lecturers, because the university, what is this? I just don't like the language of preemptive. It's like the preemptive strikes. They're attacking their own staff. They're attacking their own students. Intellectual freedom is near non-existent. I think that because a lot of these things are confidential, and because a lot of these things are not going public, we actually don't have a real sense of how much censorship and how much violence, institutional, administrative violence, exists in the university sector in Australia, and how much the chilling effect is absolutely real. But the chilling effect that I have seen this year is nothing like what it was 2 years ago, and so on and so forth. So I don't think in practice we're very far from the Germany model. I actually think that when you look at what's happening in the UK and even in parts of the US, there is more freedom, intellectual freedom, than here. So, it's really, one needs to look at what you can do and what you cannot do. I have colleagues who are teaching Palestine courses with a decolonial pedagogy that centers Palestinian scholars as the leading voice in the curriculum. This will not go in any Australian university. You'll be asked, where is the balance? And as if academia has always been unbalanced, right? Rather than on scholarship, scholarly, evidenced, intellectual, as Ghassan was saying, that kind of intellectual engagement, the real one. And I know that we're very kind of obsessed with the IHRA and the Universities of Australia, but I think it's not necessarily the definitions themselves. The UK has 75% of universities have adopted the IHRA because they were under threat by the Minister of Education years ago. And still, the situation there, far from perfect, really far from perfect. But I still, in my assessment, would say is better than here. The problem here is that the universities themselves are not willing at all to take any oppositional stance against the Zionist lobby and against politicians. I mean, think about a sector that makes the SBS and ABC look principled, right? By rejecting the IHRA. Why don't we see Universities Australia? Why don't we see the GOA come out as a sector with one clear position saying this will harm our core mission, which is being an intellectual space? So I really don't think we are far, and I think we haven't reached the worst yet. I think the Gonski task force is going to be what will bury us. We're talking about the Royal Commission. We're talking about the Craven Report. The most dangerous will be the Gonski task force. We already seen, before the recommendations came out, we already seen what's happening in the ARC. That's a result of that task force. So I think we need to be very clear on where the dangers are. I don't think we're far from curriculum oversight, and we see that, by the way, there are demands for curriculum oversight, and we are heading there. So it's not just about what you can and can't say, but slowly we'll see that space. If now it's shrinking, we're going to see it near absent in my estimation, 2027 and 2028 will be a real shit show for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the scale of repression is unequal, really. I think there has been a quantitative jump in terms of what we are subjected to, but also in terms of the global nature of the repression, which sometimes I'm comparing notes with French colleagues, with US colleagues, and I hope I'm not propagating conspiracy theory here, but sometimes they are subjected to the same sentence of questioning that I have been subjected. It's just like, so there is something different about what is happening here. The scale, the degree to which I feel we have to deal with irrationalism is incredible. Yeah, I don't know. Is it gone or no? Let me very quickly tell you, I heard a few years ago on ABC, as in American broadcasting, not Australian, there was an interview with this cult leader who was one of those people who believe in rapture, sort of like that. God is going to destroy the earth and he's going to suspend us in a bubble. And he was sitting down, and the interviewer was a classic liberal American who was kind of like, tell me whatever you like, I will accept it, and like not attacking him at all for being an idiot or anything. On the contrary, kind of like say, oh yeah, so blah blah blah, so, and say yeah, and the God is gonna suspend us, and we're going to enjoy seeing the non-believers burn before he takes us to heaven. And then I said, okay, the interviewer said, okay, but it didn't happen. He said, you said it's going to happen on 17th of July. It didn't happen. And the interviewer, being his liberal self didn't say, therefore you're an idiot. He said, maybe it's happening slowly, like in global warming. And the guy looked at him and said, global warming? Oh, wait, the jury is still out on this. And it was an incredible thing where, on one hand, the guy was happy to believe in totally surreal things, but then his hyper-empirical self came up in the face of global warming. And when you're dealing with Zionism, it's always like this. You're supposed to believe in this seriously surreal stuff about thousands of years and God and what have you. And you're supposed to believe in all these incredible things. And then comes some hyper empirical scrutiny. Oh, no, did you say here sort of like Jewish or Zionist? Or did you say, oh, no, actually, is it really more towards Zionist or towards Israeli or towards Jewish? Now you're mixing between, and sort of like people get away with saying all crazy things, and suddenly you're being subjected microscopically to the most incredible thing. So this rise of irrationalism, by the way, and I want to finish by saying this because I think it's important. You cannot support the kind of irrationalism propagated by Zionism internationally and then claim you want to fight it nationally when it's exhibited by people like One Nation. You are creating the ground for the propagation of irrationalism, and then you accuse these forces of being irrational and you want them to change their mind. You can't do this. It's the same struggle.
Just some very quick observations on those three things. I agree with the others who've said that there has been a marked upstep in the degree of repression of freedom of speech since October the 7th. I think that's, from my point of view, clearly the case. Joel's question is interesting, I think. How do we go on working with these people? After, when the genocide is over, how do we go on working with them? And the essay that springs to mind as a sort of counterposition to Popper, I think, is Marcuse's, classic essay on radical tolerance, which I often think about in these sorts of contexts. And the question for us is, what are the kinds of intolerance towards the forces that we oppose that we can get away with, showing, and which should we show? Which is it moral and politically correct to show? I think the starting point from the point of view of this society that we have on campus has to be a recognition of the social function of the university, which is that it's an institution which is aimed at social reproduction of a particular kind. The class composition of its staff is overwhelmingly bourgeois, middle class, upper middle class. Of course, it's going to be a breeding ground for the most backward, the most, racist, the most uncritical prejudices and attitudes that circulate in society more generally. It's just that there will be a veneer of progressivism and intellectual authority which is laid over them. And, our colleagues aren't bad people, most of them, I don't think, but many of them are captured completely by the overwhelming ambient ideological environment. The most important thing to them is professional success. They're deeply invested, I think, in many cases, in professional advancement, success, intellectual credit, all of these things. And these are the things that we just are inevitably standing against if we're taking on the fight for an issue like opposition to the genocide. So we are just pitting ourselves against everything that the sociology of this milieu stands for. But it's dialectic, isn't it? I mean, we know, and our experience since October the 7th has absolutely been that we can win people over to our side, and we continually do so. And I think that, if it's not about genocide, it will be about something else. University leaders are the last people who will, acknowledge any right. They belong to the most backward, the most unreconstructed the least critical sector of Australian society, I think precisely because they have this automatic mantle of critique and progressivism that comes with their role as institutional heads of universities. That insulates them from any skerrick of critical or oppositional thought. Will we get to the same place as Germany? I don't know. I think our institutional leaders are far more opportunistic. I think in Germany, from what I understand, there is a deep ideological commitment to Israelism. I don't think that exists in Australia. I think what exists is derivative of our commitment to the US alliance. So I think there are some, cushioning barriers that stand between us and a full-on Germany situation. But then that's a glass half full response.
Yeah, go ahead. Got 2 more? 3 more. Okay.
Sorry, I've mic rammed myself. One thing that I just wanted to add, kind of building off of this conversation, is just the fact that the Zionist tactics move, in terms of not being in a tutorial or wanting to have a conversation or not. I think, what you do hear from Zionists, like, oh, we just want to have a conversation. We just want to have a debate about whether genocide is the right term for what's happening in Gaza. So they do invoke that kind of like liberal, we just want to talk about this, but you're being so hostile. And yet at the same time, obviously, any questioning about whether Zionist allegations of anti-Semitism are actual anti-Semitism is itself taken as further evidence of anti-Semitism. So yeah, determining what kinds of conversations, or even whether a conversation is appropriate to have, is itself kind of captured by Zionism. And one effect of this, I think, is it makes anti-Zionists feel like we need to be experts on the history of the Middle East to be able to make basic moral claims like genocide is wrong. And so we need to just confidently reassert that, no, we don't. A genocide is a genocide. The other thing about Dave's point about, support for Israel is an expression of human rights. I think one way kind of self-identified progressive managers kind of circumvent having to explicitly make that argument is by talking about feelings, by talking about lived experience. But again, that is, kind of civil cover for authoritarianism. I just wanted to say that.
Thanks very much, Finn. We've got 2 more and we might close the evening. Was it Luna? Very quickly, please, if you don't mind. And then we've got you, Lucky Love.
Hello. Yes. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you, everyone. I guess we have to think through just like the repression that we're facing, right? And it is true that over the years, they've been building this infrastructure of repression. And that is because they are just authoritarian and undemocratic spaces in society. So, for example, we talk a lot about the confidentiality requirements. Those were actually put in place by management to protect rape culture on this campus, specifically to cover up the crisis of sexual violence in the colleges. And I painfully learned that the university can weaponize visa precarity, and that is why they stop international students from organizing for their own rights on this campus, and they continue this process of casualizing staff, specifically to subject university staff to procedurally unfair and politically motivated dismissals. And Ghassan is right, actually, that what we're talking about is not truth claims, it's no longer a tutorial. That, in fact, I'm always reminded that we, the Free Palestine movement, for the most part, mostly we win in courts and in public opinion. But it is true that we just lose behind closed doors in investigations and in boardrooms and in offices and immigration. And that is the situation that we're facing.
Thanks very much. Just limiting it to 1 minute, please. So just so we can wrap up in a timely fashion.
Hi, thanks everyone for organizing today and for that great panel just then. It's been interesting to hear these kind of harkenings back to the 60s and kind of campus radicalism. And I think there are some continuities, but I think an important point of change is the like crazily downward trajectory that unis are on at the moment. But because of that, also a kind of upswell of contestation of the university as a work site as well. And it's been, cool to hear kind of calls for industrial action to back up demands. Nevertheless, I think that universities, despite being like a really large workplace, are kind of difficult to cohere. In my own experience in University of Melbourne, that was certainly the case. But it's also seemed like management has been pointed to as a kind of common enemy by perhaps more secure members of the staff and more casual members of the staff. So I was just wondering on that note, any thoughts about kind of organising in the tertiary sector at the moment and cohering quite a different workplace?
Thanks very much, everyone. Just to wrap up, in terms of alternatives to palliative progressive politics and careerism that Nick mentioned, it seems that the vector that everyone is leading towards is a more militant approach, given this defeat that, we're experiencing. I'd invite everyone who does have energy left over to join us at the Royal. But if you have any final reflections, everyone has given a lot of energy and I'm sure is tired, but maybe we just give it up for everyone with some applause.